Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to do another story for you today. I just wanted to say something really quickly. Before I say that, if you're one of those guys who always send me messages saying get to the point, just skip forward because I've got to say this. So if you've sent me a story, please be patient because I'm getting quite a few stories getting sent to me right now. And if you can imagine, they're quite long. I have to read them several times and put them into a format. Sometimes I have to take out swear words. I have to readjust them a little bit. So they are very time consuming. I've got quite a few backed up right now, but as I say, I will read them all, and if I can make a video on any of them, I certainly will do, so please be patient with me. Okay, right, so today's video is about a guy called Paul and a lady called Nit. I don't know her full name, they're just nicknames. It's spelled N-I-T. This story goes back to about 2001, and Paul at the time, he'd gone through a very bad divorce. It was one of those divorces that went on through the courts for months. His wife had tried to take, most of what he owned, but he managed to retain quite a lot of it. So at this time, Paul had decided to locate to Bangkok. He'd been there several times before, just on vacation, but he decided he was going to pack up and live there. And he had actually been living there for a couple of years by the time this story started. I'll tell you where he lived. If you don't know Bangkok, this won't make any sense to you, but hundreds and thousands of people go to Soy Cowboy every year, so you'll understand exactly where I mean. If you come in from, not the Asok end, but the other end, you'll go past the go-go bar on the left, which is called Crazy Horse. On the corner, there used to be a restaurant called The Ship. That's now gone. Very good restaurant, by the way. So if you can imagine, you've just turned into Soy Cowboy, and you're looking down the Soy. Directly behind you, if you turn around, you'll see a block of apartments right there, right on the end of Soy Cowboy, just over the road. That's actually where Paul used to stay. He had a very nice 2-bedroom apartment in that block right there. Nit, on the other hand, she lived quite a way out of the centre of Bangkok, but her bar was very close to Paul's apartment. If you walk into Soy Cowboy, you come in the same way as I've just explained. It was one of the I can't remember the name of it. It was a go-go bar, and it was one of the bars on the left. It was virtually the first one. So you'd go past a Ship, and it was one of those kind of long, narrow bars, stage in the middle, quite a few girls in there. As I say, I can't remember the name of it now, but Nit worked in there. The difference with Nit is she didn't come down to work in Bangkok like a lot of the other girls. They come down when they're very young, and they go through the mill, and by the time some of these guys get to them, they've got a lot of experience. Nit actually didn't come down to Bangkok until she was about 30. At the time of this story, Nit was 38, and I believe Paul was 48. So only about a 10-year age difference there. And because of Nit's age, she wasn't the most popular bar in the girl. She was very pleasant. She was quite an attractive girl, but obviously there's a lot younger girls than her that were working in the bar, 20 plus, and she wasn't as popular as them. But she was working there, and she made money from drinks and things like that. So let's start the story. Paul, because he was on his own, he got over his marriage and everything. He was fine. He just decided he wasn't going to marry anybody again. He'd gone through everything, and he was happy now. So he was living in Bangkok. He had friends. He lived in the apartment that I've just explained to you. He was quite financially stable. He was quite well off. He wasn't rich. And one of the bars that he'd go in very often is the first bar on the left that I just explained to you, where Nit worked. And the reason he liked that bar, because one, it was very close to his apartment. He could nip in there for a couple of drinks. And two, he knew all the girls and he knew the staff, and he was a real regular in there. So occasionally, the situation with Nit, Paul was very switched on to the bar scene. He wasn't like any of the other guys in the stories where he'd fall for tricks and schemes. He knew exactly what he was doing. But he did like the girls. He thought they were all very pleasant. And he particularly liked Nit, but he made it very clear nothing would ever come of it, and it was simply a business transaction, let's call it that. And Nit understood that as well. Now, when I'm describing or talking about Nit, her English was broken. She didn't speak really good English, but enough to get by. But I'm not going to mimic a Thai girl who can't speak great English. I'm just going to speak normally, and that way you'll get the whole story. So one thing with Paul, he did like Nit, I've got to keep this clean for YouTube, I'm always saying this, other than having Nit back in his apartment, he actually enjoyed her company. So sometimes, obviously a guy living on his own, he likes a bit of company sometimes. Sometimes he'd say to Nit, look, you know, what time do you start work? She'd say 5 o'clock, and he'd say, do you want to meet me at 4 o'clock and we'll have a bite to eat together? Then you can go straight into work. Or on a quiet night, he'd be in the bar and he'd pay a bar fine just to have a bit of company. And they'd go out and have a few drinks somewhere else, or they'd go to the cinema. And he genuinely liked her company. But as I said earlier, he wasn't going to get sucked into any sick buffalo stories or anything like that. He knew exactly where he was, where he stood. The only downside for Paul was living in that apartment right at the end of Soy Cowboy. The girls knew where he lived, and obviously if they're working, then it's easy money for them, isn't it? If they knock on his door and you know, he invites them in. Nit wasn't Paul's only kind of friend. He did see lots of other girls, well, several other girls. Nit would sometimes turn up. She'd turn up after the bar had closed. Sometimes he was sleeping, or he'd pretend he was sleeping. He wouldn't open the door. He knew who it was. Other times she'd knock his door before she went to the bar. So she started at 5. They go in early, you know, they all eat together and put their makeup on, and then they, when the bar opens later, they're all ready. And sometimes Nit would nip over to Paul's apartment, knock the door, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and the plan was to try and get some money before she actually started work. Sometimes he'd let her in, other times he wouldn't. Sometimes he'd let her in, but nothing happened, if you know what I mean. But something very important in this story, because of Paul's, because of his stability financially, he used to like to go down to Pattaya very, very often. And to anybody who hasn't been to Pattaya, Pattaya is the best way to describe it, it has 25,000 working girls there, if that makes sense. You'll have to read between the lines. So Paul used to like to go down there. He actually rented an apartment, a real nice apartment. And again, if you haven't been to Pattaya, this won't make any sense to you, but hundreds of thousands of people visit Pattaya, so you should know where I'm sort of describing. So imagine you're coming down the second road and you get to the Dolphin roundabout. This is going the opposite way to Jump Tin. You get to the Dolphin roundabout, and instead of turning left to go down to the beach, you go straight. That area is called Naklua. I probably pronounced it wrong, but that's the name of the area. And before you get to the next roundabout, you'll get to another roundabout, and that has a couple of big soapy massage parlors on the left. About halfway between the two roundabouts on the left, I can't remember the soy number, but if you go down one of those soys, eventually you'll get right down to the end, and there's a very, very nice apartment block there. And Paul rented a 2-bedroom apartment in there. I think back in 2001, it was about 10,000 baht a month. It almost had a private beach. I stayed with him a few times, nice big balcony, and it was very, very nice. So Paul, why am I telling you this? Okay, so Paul used to go down there very often. It saved him paying out on hotels. It was very quiet, easy to get into the centre of Bangkok. So this is why he rented the apartment. Because he liked the company of Nit, he would often take Nit down for the weekend, or he'd go down midweek and he'd pay the bar for a couple of days and he'd take her down. And it wasn't, it was more for companionship. You know, he'd like to eat in small restaurants, seafood restaurants, that sort of thing, and he enjoyed Nit's company, so he'd take it down from time to time. Eventually, Paul decided that he liked Pattaya so much, he liked this apartment, he decided he got a bit fed up of these girls knocking on his doors, you know, at the end of Soy 33, and he made up his mind. He thought, you know, I go down to Pattaya so often, I might as well go down there full time. And that's what he did. He gave up his apartment at the end of Soy 33. He had lunch with Nit, and he explained, he said, look, Nit, you know, I'm moving down to Pattaya. I don't know, I'll probably see you sometime in the future, because obviously I'll visit Bangkok, and when I visit Bangkok, I'll visit Soy Cowboy, and I'll come to your bar, we'll have a drink together, that sort of thing. But other than that, that's pretty much it. Nit was a little bit sad at this news, but there's not a lot she could do. And eventually Paul headed down to his apartment in Pattaya, set up home, and just carried on where he left off, except this time he's in Pattaya rather than Bangkok. About a month goes by, and Paul is having his breakfast on his balcony. It's about 9:30 in the morning. He gets a knock at the door. Wasn't expecting anybody. Goes to his front door, opens it up. Who stood there? It's Nit. And he's saying, what are you doing down there? What are you doing here? So she basically explained, she said, look, I miss you, and it's a bit quiet up in Bangkok at the moment. I wanted to take a few days out. I've come down on the bus. You can take one of these blue buses from Bangkok to Pattaya. They're not very expensive. And she said, I just thought I'd come and visit you. I hope you don't mind. And he was like, come in, you know, no problem. And to cut a long story short, Nit ended up there for about a month. She actually stayed with Paul. As I said at the beginning of the story, he very much liked her company. And but eventually he said to her, look, Nit, you've been here for a month. I've enjoyed your company and we've had a good time, but you can't live with me. You've got to go. He gave her a few thousand baht and sent her on her way. And as far as Paul was concerned, that was it. So believe it or not, living in a place like Pattaya, it's an adult playground, but it can actually get boring. I lived in Pattaya for about 3 years. And it can get a bit monotonous, all the sort of nightlife bar scene. It gets to a point where you just don't want it anymore. And I think this was what was happening with Paul. He was going out every night. He wasn't a guy who was going to sit in his apartment on his own. So he'd have a routine. He'd, you know, they had a nice pool at the apartments. He'd sit there for a lot of the day. He'd go shopping in the day, you know, the sort of thing you do in Pattaya. But he'd go out most nights. This was in the days when the bar stayed up until 5, 6 in the morning. And the Marina Disco at the time, that was open all night virtually, packed full of all the girls that worked in the bar used to go there after their bars closed. It was a great place to go. But Paul would go out every night, and eventually he started to get a little bit bored of this. But what else can you do? You're in Pattaya. And a few weeks later, again, same thing, Nick knocks on his door. She's there again, and she said, you know, same as the last time, I missed you and can I stay a while? And, you know, Paul didn't mind. And in fact, this time he was actually glad to see her because, as I say, he was getting quite bored with the bar scene. And it went on for a lot longer than a month. He basically let her move in with him. I don't know what the financial situation was. Obviously, he would have been supporting her in one form or the other. But she was now living with him. One day, Nick came back. She'd been out all afternoon. She said to Paul, look, Paul, I've got some news to tell you. Are you ready for this? And he was like, oh my God, what's this going to be? She turned around and she says, look, Paul, I'm pregnant. I'm expecting a baby. And he was just shocked. So the first thing that came to Paul's mind, I know it's horrible, but the first thing he thought about, well, you know, she's a bar girl, or she was a bar girl, and, you know, I'm not going to assume that it's mine. Well, I'll cut through the chase. Basically what happened is they had tests done, and to cut a long story short, yeah, it was Paul's baby. He was definitely the father, and he wasn't sure what to do about this. You know, he was a nice guy. He wasn't going to leave her. You know, he wasn't going to just abandon her. And on the other hand, though, he didn't want to just continually send her money and not see his child. Eventually, Nit had a little girl. They called her Nut. I don't know how to spell that. Weird names, I know. Little baby girl, they called her Nut. And obviously the three of them were living as a family in this apartment, in this rented apartment in Naklua. And eventually, a few years later, Paul decided he was going to go back to the UK. That's what he did. He packed everything up. He headed back, and he was a bit older by this time. I think he was around 51 now, something like that. They'd been together a couple of years, and he basically decided he was going to head back. And that's really the end of the story. You know, Paul was back in the UK. Now, the question you'll be asking is, where is Nit and Nut? I'll tell you exactly where they are. They live in Leicester with Paul. Nut has now been with Paul for approximately 19 to 20 years, something like that. Their daughter, Nut, I'm getting names mixed up here. The daughter, Nut, she's at Loughborough University. She's training to be a doctor, and it's a successful story. Basically, that's what's happened. They're all living in Leicester. The daughter's in university, Loughborough University, studying to be a doctor. And it is actually quite nice to tell you a story that was a success story. I've been saving that one for a while because a lot of my stories come out as negative, but I can only tell you them as they're told to me or I've seen. And this one is one of the few positive stories I can tell you about. So I hope you enjoyed that one, and I'll catch you all on the next video.